Good evening, everyone, and a big welcome to you all for tonight's webinar presented by Meat and Livestock Australia and ParaBoss. My name is Liz Baiocchi and I work for the University of New England as a ParaBoss project officer. A big thanks first to Meat and Livestock Australia, as this webinar has been developed under MLA's New England WormBoss Producer Demonstration Site project. But this topic applies equally across all regions in Australia. It's on the importance of drench resistance and how you can check the status of drench resistance on your property. I'd now like to introduce you to Deb Maxwell from the University of New England. Deb is the Executive Officer of ParaBoss, and she's been at the forefront of the development of ParaBoss in conjunction with parasitologists, researchers, and veterinarians from around the country. Welcome, Deb. We're all looking forward to what you can tell us about drench resistance testing.
Thanks very much, Liz. Now, as Liz said, this is an instructional webinar on drench resistance testing and how it can help to inform your drenching decisions and slow down the development of drench resistance on your property. Now, a drench resistance test is also called a drench test or a worm egg count or fecal egg count reduction test, and it's the gold standard for assessing the effectiveness of drenches against the worms on your property. It provides really essential information for drench decisions. It will ultimately save you more than you've spent through more effective drench use. Because resistance continues to change on your property, we think that you should do these drench tests each 3 years. Just to clarify this test, drench resistance involves drenching small groups of sheep with different drenches and comparing their worm egg count to a control group. And it is a little bit different from what we call a drench check, which just involves doing a worm test before and after a mob drench. But I'll discuss that later. Now, I'm assuming that most of you are listening to this webinar because you've never done a drench test before, or maybe not a comprehensive one. And I'd just like to collect some data on what things hold people back from doing a drench test. And Liz has prepared a poll for us here, and I think, and what we wanted to see on there was what has prevented you or put you off from doing a drench test, even if you've ultimately done one. And I'll just go through and read out the options that you can choose, and I want you to be able to choose more than one if they apply to you. Choose from any of these as I talk you through them. I don't have drench resistance on my property, so that's why I haven't done them before. Or the drenches I use are all new types, so I know they work. Maybe you haven't done it because you know what drenches don't work, and so you haven't needed to test those. Or I don't know what the benefit of a drench test would be. Maybe you think they're too complex, they require too much work, or they're too expensive. Or you don't know what the process is or how to do the test. Or you haven't got anyone to help you do one. Or it might be as simple as you can't get the drenches required, or you haven't got enough animals for the tests. Or you don't want to test single active drenches because you don't normally use them. And the final option, of course, affects me sometimes with things, is I put it off and never got around to it. So just mark off those that tend to be things that doing a drench test so far or in the past. Now, while Liz calculates those results and they all get collated, I'll just tell you a little bit about the benefits of a drench test. Firstly, I interviewed 8 producers who did their drench tests with this project. That's the MLA WormBoss Producer Demonstration Site project. And I was actually really surprised to hear their response when I asked them how important they thought a drench test was. They all said, top of the marks, essential. Now, half of them hadn't even done one before, but they were all totally converted to the importance of them when they saw their own drench test results. Out of the 11 tests, only one person had 4 out of 8 drenches remaining at 100% effective. Interestingly, that same had 2 worst recorded cases of drench resistance. 2 other people had no 100% effective. So I'll show you their test results later. Now, the drench choices of these people, now it's almost always based around the results of that drench resistance test. So even though the consequences aren't immediately obvious to you, when you use an ineffective drench, you will get losses in sheep health and production. And if you go about trying to prepare low worm risk paddocks, it really is almost impossible to do that if you don't know what drenches actually work on your place. As for the cost, well, an ineffective drench, no matter how cheap to buy, will always be expensive to use. Okay, Liz, can we see those results now? And the top answer was down at I don't know what the process is or how to do the test. And oh no, and a lot of people just haven't got round to it. I really can relate to that one. We've just got so much to do. So anyway, I think if I can outline all that's involved in that test tonight, it might make it a bit easier and might stop you putting it off, and you'll get around to it. Okay, so let's have a look. How do we do the test? Cover off all these things so you know exactly what's involved. So let's make a start. Equipment. Okay, first thing you really need is a helper. Sure, you can do it alone, but you're more likely to make mistakes or mix things up. Really, it's just plain awkward sometimes. The drenching and the tagging and the dung collection processes they're not difficult, but you do have to be moving back and forth between drenching and tagging and collecting and recording, and it really is far easier to have in with the sheep or next to the sheep and another person passing all the required gear. It's actually a really great opportunity to work with a friend or a neighbour. Both of you should do a test and then you help each other out. Now, the test is carried out on 2 separate days and you will need some gear. Syringes are usually the easiest thing for giving the various drenches, but you can use a drench gun and pack. But it is a bit hard work having to clean them out really, really thoroughly between the drench groups, because if you don't and you get some of that drench mixed in together, you really don't know which one's doing the job. Now, you can actually buy these cute little single dose drench guns in the picture here. Most of the online farm supply shops actually have those, and they are pretty handy to use in a situation like this. It's easier than getting a syringe into the sheep's mouth. You'll need weigh scales. Bathroom scales will do the job, just to weigh a few sheep. A measuring container, you'll be checking your dose of drench in that first, and of course you'll need some drench. Now, how much drench do you need? Well, you're going to drench 15 animals, so it's probably wise to have enough for 20 animals just in case you miss something. And you're probably going to end up needing maybe about 250 mils or maybe up to 400 mils of any particular drench. But you will actually need to double that amount if you're going to use a drench gun and pack, because as it's jiggling around, you don't want to be getting air into that tube, so you will need a little bit more into it. Now, you do need to identify the sheep as well. You've got to match to their drench group so that when you come back a couple of weeks, you know which samples belong to which drench group. So coloured tags are ideal. You can use spray mark as long as you can make it reliably last 2 weeks. That's not always easy, so I'd go with tags. You can use individual tag numbers on the sheep if you have them, but really colour coding does make the job easier when you bring them back to collect from them. As far as recording equipment goes, you'll need a pen and paper, maybe some permanent markers, and any reporting sheets provided by your laboratory. Now, you'll also need some gear to do the wet collections in the 2 weeks' time. So that'll be bottles or bags to collect those samples. And they're from all the individual sheep, so it won't be a bulk. You'll also need lubricant, a bucket of soapy water, some gloves, maybe a table or a trolley to put your bucket and so forth on. And if it's warm weather, an esky is pretty handy. You can actually look on one of our pages. We've got a page on ParaBoss called Collecting Dung Samples from Individual Sheep and Goats, and that's got a fair few tips on it about what you need and how to do this process. Okay, when do you test? Well, it does depend where you are. The best time of the year is when the animals are likely to be infected with all of the worm species that is commonly on your farm. Unfortunately, Barber's poleworms and the various scour worm species don't tend to always be abundant at the same time. If you're in southern Australia, tests are typically done at weaning time. But if you're in the northern summer rainfall areas, winter is typically a better time to test. And the weaners are a bit older at that point, but you're also away from the high-risk summer Barber's poleworm time. And there's actually more chance then of getting a few scour worms in your samples as well. But what you don't want is the paddocks to be so contaminated that the sheep are picking up a really high burden of worm larvae in that lead up to the test, because in that 2 weeks of time from drenching through to testing, the group that won't have received a drench, plus there's ones that will have received drenches that aren't really all that effective, and it just means they're going to be getting a much worse worm burden build up in that time. And so it's just a lot better to do it at a time when there's just a steady or gradual increase in worms. Now, animals. Well, you want to test young sheep. Sometimes people find it difficult and they ask me, oh, can I use these older ewes? But their natural resistance does get in the way a bit of this test. So ideally you want animals that are less than a year old, and they need to be the same sex and breed and bloodline, and then as close as possible to the same weight and age. So, for instance, it's really no good saying, oh, I've only got so many sheep, I'll use both my crossbred lambs and my merino lambs in this test. That's really going to make it awkward. It won't work. So the other thing is that they should have the same history, same last drench, which was given on the same day, and then they've been run together. If you don't have enough animals of the same age and type, you can still do a drench test with fewer numbers, but what you will need to do is before and after worm egg counts on each animal, rather than just a comparison to the undrenched group at 14 days after drenching. Or you can test a smaller number of drenches at this time, and then at another time test some of your other drenches. However, you're going to need a control group with all of these as well. And so if you are a bit short on numbers, look, ask one of your professional advisors and they'll be able to help you with your experimental design. Failing this, a drench check, which I'll talk about again later, should be done, and it's certainly very handy for people that have got smaller numbers of animals. Now, when you reach the time of year when you want to test, you should be using your normal worm tests to decide whether the mob's got enough worms for the drench test. What you can do is, if you don't normally always do a culture, you can ask the lab to do a culture on your sample if it's at a certain level. If you think, you know, I'm wanting to see at least a 500 eggs per gram result before I even think about doing a drench test, you can mark on your worm test submission form, do a culture if we're up at 500 eggs per gram. And then what that will do is tell you how much or what proportion of the count is what species, and you'll be able to then decide whether you're at a high enough level. Because if you don't have enough of each species of the species that you want to look at, you're not going to actually get accurate results. We certainly find where I live in the New England, where typically a lot of farms will test and they will barely have 5% of their worms being scour worms, and that's tough luck. We just don't have many options. We try and test in winter to overcome that, but sometimes that doesn't work. In southern half of Australia, you could be in the opposite situation where you don't really have Barber's poleworm. And quite frankly, if one of those worms isn't a big issue for you, then it doesn't really matter. You test when you get to levels that are high enough for the particular worms that are important in your area. Which drenches? Now, combination products are usually the best choice for worm control, but it's not the best choice for doing a drench test. Now, we advise that you test the single actives only. And the reason for this is that you're then going to know how good each of the components within your combinations, how well that they are working. Otherwise, you actually won't know whether a combo is really just acting as a single acting drench. If you've got, say, a duo type drench, one of your typical double actives that have got levamisole and a BZ in them, a white drench, you might find that you're getting really effective results, close to 100% results. Now up here, I get that sort of results with mine, but when I test them individually, I find that levamisole's doing all the hard work and the BZs are doing nothing at all. So I think that I'm using a drench when really I'm using a single active drench because one of them's not really working at all. So by testing your singles, you'll know that. The other thing about testing your singles is it gives you the opportunity to calculate all of the possible combinations that you might want to use. And so that's going to save you quite a lot of money instead of actually testing all those combinations. And actually, I'm not a statistician, but they all tell me that when you calculate the results, because those calculations are based on more animals from a number of groups, they're actually more accurate than if you tested them directly. So which of those single actives are we going to use? Let me have a look at those. We've got a number of them if you're doing a comprehensive test. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this, and I'll get into that. But if you do the comprehensive test, you'd be testing levamisole. Then you'd use one of the BZ drenches. So that's either albendazole or fenbendazole or oxfendazole. You don't need to do all of them. Just one of them will do the trick. In the macrocyclic lactone group, there is another active, ivermectin, but it's, well, I don't think it's ever as good as ivermectin, and so we suggest that use ivermectin in, and but you should test your abamectin and your moxidectin. Now, naphthalphos, that's an organophosphate. It's mostly used against Barber's poleworm, so if you're not in a Barber's poleworm area, you can skip that one. And the same sort of for closantel. It's only for Barber's poleworm, so if you're just in a scourworm area, don't use closantel. Monopantel, it's a new drench, and so is dequantel. And dequantel is combined with abamectin. Those two drenches, monopantel, and is Zolvex. Dequantal with abamectin is Startect. Even though they're new, they are generally still highly effective for most people. We're finding that results aren't always 100%, and that's inevitable. Drench resistance is going to develop, and so it's pretty wise if you include those in a test to check how they are performing for you and just to see if there is any emerging resistance. Now, if you're in southern Australia and you're in an area where Barber's just really is rare, it's just not a problem for you, there is one option you can take, and that is to use Closantel, which is typically highly effective against Barber's poleworm in those areas. What you can do is you can treat the mob with the Closantel right at the drench test time or just in the week or two beforehand. And what will happen is that you'll remove all the Barber's poleworm, and also you won't have to use naphthalophos in your test. But it also means that when you do your test, you shouldn't need to culture for the worms. All you want to do is get a general picture of scourworm effectiveness. Trouble is, it won't tell you about any differential resistance for the various scourworms. And certainly there is evidence that some scourworms, so the brown stomach worm, has emerging resistance to some drenches when maybe the black scourworm doesn't. So while you can do that, we still recommend that you are better off doing a culture each time you do one of these tests. You'll know the results to each specific worm. We don't include praziquantel and triclobendazole because they don't target roundworms. They're for either tapeworms or liver fluke. So where do you get the things from? Well, you can put a bit of a kit together yourself, but it can be difficult to get small amounts of single active drenches. Some laboratories, some of your worm egg counting laboratories will be able to sell you a full kit or just small amounts of the drenches that you require. But I tell you, if you get an opportunity to do a drench test as part of a project or with one of the drench companies, jump at it, because it's much easier if you do that, and you'll often have them at a reduced cost. And speaking of the drench companies, I would like to thank again the companies that helped this project, and they supplied drench, and that's Bayer and Cooper's Animal Health, Elanco Animal Health, Durox, WSD and Zoetis, and Swinger Tag from WA supplied the tags and the pliers for our drench tests in the trial. So you're going to need 10 to 15 animals for each drench active that you want to test, plus treat control group, and they'll also need 10 to 15 animals. And if you're testing the 8 actives that we recommend, and you have 15 animals in each, 8 plus 1 is 9 times 15, that's 135 animals. So in the initial draft of animals, include 135 plus about 10 or 20 extra animals, just in case some end up being unsuitable, to drench them. Now, draft off that required number of animals, and as you do, get rid of all the ones that are the heavier end, all the ones that are the lighter end, get rid of that are sick or injured or, unusual in some way, so you've got a really nice even line. Now, 15 animals is what you want to drench with and tag in the beginning. However, you will be wanting to sample a minimum of 10 from those groups. Ask your laboratory whether they want 10 or 15. If only 10 are needed, the extra 5 that you start with, they're going to be spares in case some die or escape or you can't find them. Or sometimes some are just really hard to collect dung from. So let's talk about the steps that we've got here. There's 2 steps, and they're 10 to 14 days apart. Now, 14 days is the ideal. You can come back as soon as 10 days, but don't go past the 14 days. Allocate enough time, a few hours to organise your gear and set yourself up, maybe before the first day of the test. But then you will want about 20 or 30 minutes per group on the drenching day once you've got them into the yards. So, you know, that's going to amount to about 3 to 4 hours for 2 people. Time that drenching day in the place so that the sampling day occurs 14 days later on either a Sunday, a Monday, or a Tuesday, ideally. And that way you can get your samples to the lab early in the week. Most of the labs will prefer it early in the week because it's quite a lot of tests that they're going to do. They may not be able to do them all on one day. And make sure that you book the job in with the lab so they actually do have enough staff, because it is a big job. You should also allow at least 4 hours on that second day of the test. That's when you're collecting the samples. So if you also have a third person, that can make it even easier. Now, on that first day, that's the drenching day, bring in the sheep, draft off the required number of sheep as we've described and the spares, put the other sheep out of the way. But remember, you'll have done a drench test just beforehand, and if they were wormy enough for this test, maybe they're going to be wormy enough for the mob to drench. And so you can just set them aside and drench them after you've done the trial part. Now, from the group you've kept, look for the five or so biggest animals in the mob and weigh them. Even if you're just using your bathroom scales. Bathroom scales can be a little bit difficult for the big guys out there because they don't necessarily hold the weight of the person holding a sheep as well. So if you're not too big, they might work for you. But otherwise, it's a good idea to borrow some proper scales if you don't have any. So record those weights, and then what you need to do is calculate what your drench doses will be. Now, they won't be the same for all of your drenches. So those dose rates vary. So they're typically 1 mil per 5 kilo or 1 mil per 10 kilo. But some are even different to that. So set out all your drenches on the table, and you can see in the image that we've got here, this is from one of the tests that we did with our operators. We've got all of the drenches set out on the table. Each of them has a syringe for them. There's a nice little piece of paper here that's got the dose on it that we've calculated from the weights. We've got the coloured tags ready to put in the sheep and the tag gun. And some of those drenches there, any of the sort of more milky drenches and the Ramadan drench we had, an OP, they've actually got a spoon or a stirrer in them. Actually, I think they've just got sticks in those ones. But you do need to give them a stir every now and again because they'll settle out. The syringe that you have, you should have a few extras. You will find that Zolvex and StarTech do have a bit of a rough time on your syringes. They can either crack the syringe or they can affect the little rubber plunger in the syringes and make it pretty hard after a while. So just have some spares on hand. And just note that these containers here, they're going to be easy to let you put your syringe in and get some of that drench out. Whereas if you've got some sort of narrow type bottle, you're not going to be able to do that. Finally, if you don't use those syringes, got a drench gun, remember you're going to have to clean out between each one, but also you're going to need more than that amount of drench just to keep the air bubbles out of the container. Now, getting on to the actual process of, so you've got to drench and tag the animals. There's not just one way to do this, but I'll just describe two methods here. The first method is to drench and tag all 15 sheep in one drench group. You then let the race and then you do the next group and so on. The trouble with this method is that you do risk getting all the stronger, heavier type sheep right up the race early, and they get, and that's going to bias your results. So you can try to avoid this. Just go out, move the mob around the yard to mix them up a little bit, and then just bring up the 15 that you need for that group. And that'll just keep them, well, a little bit randomized. Then what you're going to do is check, before you do anything, check that the correct details have been recorded for the tag color or the individual tag number or the spray mark or any other information you happen to be using to identify that. So make sure you've definitely got the right tag color lined up for that drench, and you've got that recorded somewhere, safe for when you need it in 2 weeks' time again. Treat each of the animals very carefully. You can just go right up the race and treat them all, and then you can come back and tag them. Watch them a few seconds, make sure they don't spit the drench out. And if they do, just reject that animal from the trial and bring in another one. That's why you've got some spares. Once you've identified them, then you can send them out of the race. When you use this method, it is possible that you can use a drench gun and pack because you're doing them all at once. Again, remember, clean it out before you get that next group really thoroughly. So then you just repeat that same process. Mix the sheep up in the yard, bring in another group of 15, drench them, tag them, let them all out. Now there's an alternate method, and that ensures the sheep are more randomly allocated to the drench, so you don't get stronger ones all getting that same drench. So all you do is progressively drench along the race, bring in any number of sheep into the race. The first sheep gets drench number 1, second sheep and the matching tag. Second sheep gets drench number 2 and the matching tag, so forth. You get down to the 9th sheep. It gets a tag but no drench because it belongs to the control group. And then you start again with the next sheep getting drench 1 and the tag corresponding to group 1. Next one gets drench 2, and you just going down the race there, alternating the drenches, using all of them, then starting again. Make sure, however, that you do one sheep at a time. That means this is particularly where you want 2 people. One person's there with that sheep. They drench the sheep and don't let go of that sheep. The helper is handing them the tag next, so you don't accidentally get the wrong color tag into that sheep. This one, it's a little bit faster. You're not having to draft off the separate groups. And remember, if you have to draft them, maybe you don't have all the pens that you need for them. So I find that this one's good, especially if you've got 2 people and you're just careful about what you're doing. Now, there are other ways that you could do it, and some might work better in certain facilities, but the important things to realise are, number 1, go slowly. This is not a job where speed and efficiency is a good idea. The faster you go, more mistakes will get made. Secondly, decide on the process that you're going to do, whether it's one of those ones I've described or something different. You and your helper decide what you're going to do in advance and then stick to it and develop a routine. If partway through or after you've started you think, gee, this doesn't seem to be working as well as I thought it was going to work, stop the whole process, think about it, replan what you're going to do, start your different process, both of you agreeing what's about to go. Now, the other thing that I really do stress to people is do your own job and no one else's. If some delay occurs with the other person, say their phone rings or they drop something or whatever, just stop. If you step in and do their job in the meantime, I can guarantee you a mistake will occur. So this isn't an activity where getting the job done fast is the important thing, avoiding making mistakes. Finally, the other thing is, difficult as it might be for some people, avoid conversation, both between yourselves or with someone else that rocks up for a chat. Ask them to come back later. The more you talk, the more likely a mistake will occur. And turn off your phone at the same time if you can. Now, with this stage, you shouldn't need to collect dung from any animals on this day unless you happen to have not enough animals and you've got to do a before test as well. So once all the sheep are drenched and tagged and you've got all the information recorded, you can return them to the paddock. Any of the unused sheep, the spares or rejected animals, you can return them to the original mob, and you can drench the remainder of the mob at this time if they need it. You can mix all of the treated and control groups together, and you can actually put them all back into the main mob, but that's going to make life difficult for you in 2 weeks when you need to get them back out again. So I recommend that you keep them separate, keep a paddock that's not too far from the yards, and that is preferably a good, secure paddock so that you're not going to lose them in that time. Okay, so what we're going to see now is what we do next. Right. Your second day of your test, that's when you're going to collect the fecal samples, and it's going to be 14 days after that drenching day. So that's the same day of the week that you did the other one. If necessary, you can cut it back to as early as 10 days. Don't do it after 14 days. So you really do need to plan and make sure that you're going to have enough time, and hopefully there's no emergencies going to arise in that time. Again, allocate plenty of time, 20 to 30 minutes a group. Half a day, that will be typically if you've got, say, 9 groups. You're not rushed. Again, there's different ways to do this. You can either draft the test animals into the separate treatment and control groups based on their coloured ear tag, or if you're careful, you can collect and place samples in appropriate boxes from just having the sheep all brought up the race together. The critical thing is to ensure that no matter what you do, that the right sample goes into the right box. So you've got to match that tag colour with the particular box that's got that drench group going to be tested. So set your bags and your bottles and so forth so that you can sample from the number of animals that your lab wants you to do. And as I said before, 10 should be the minimum, but 15 is much more accurate. But of course, 5 more than the 10, so it is going to be about half the price again, but it is more accurate. You'll probably find that the bottles or the bags are likely to be individually numbered, and that's just so that the lab will be able to keep track and report back to you exactly which sheep in which group was what. If you draft the groups, well, I will say the first thing is if you're doing 9 groups of sheep, some of you are going to find it quite difficult. Draft 9 groups, you'll probably have to bring them right round through the race again. So that's going to put a lot of people off that. So if you have drafted the groups, bring the first group into the race, check the tag colour that you've got, make sure that you've got the right box, and you've got your piece of paper from 2 weeks ago that's going to say the sheep with the orange tag are Zolvix, for instance, or the ones with the yellow tag are Levamisole. So you're going to make sure you have that right container there with all the sampling bottles in there for that particular group. Now you need to take a dung sample from the rectum of the first animal and put it into an individual bottle or a bag, and place that into that marked box. Then you just repeat the process until you've got at least the 10 individual samples or up to 15. If you wanted to collect 15, but you find that only 14 in this group come in after 2 weeks, don't worry about that. Collect 15 for all the other groups that you can, and some groups might be missing one. Nevertheless, having more is going to be more accurate. Now, if only 10 samples are required, those other animals are just spare in case you find that dung is quite difficult to collect from one animal. But if you find that's the case, typically you can just push that sheep out into a side pen and come back in another 15 or 30 minutes, and generally you're going to be able to find some samples for them. I find that I'll be up the race with some sheep and I'll have that extra sheep out the side there, and if you keep an eye on them, sometimes you can see them actually pass some dung and you can race over and pick it up. When you're collecting, if you're in a hotter area, you might need an esky during that process, maybe with some ice bricks in it. And once you've collected a little group of samples, make sure they get put into the esky. Sorry, we've lost that one again. Now, repeat that process for the next group of animals and so on until you've got all of them sampled, each one group at a time. If, however, you didn't draft the groups up, what you'll need to do is set out all of your collection boxes on, say, on a table, and you'll have a pile of sample bottles. And as those sheep come up race, in any order, they'll all have different coloured tags. Just collect from the first one, make sure you note what colour it is, and then just go and place its sample into the correct box. And so you'll just gradually be filling up the boxes. Just keep, if you're only doing, say, 10 samples from them, just keep an eye on how many you've collected so that you don't suddenly find you've got 15 or, you've got 12 in one box when you only wanted 10. The sheep, once you've got the 10, then the next animal that comes up in that group, you don't need to collect from. As mentioned, same as the drenching day, go slowly. Follow a routine. Don't take over someone else's job. Because if you don't properly match sheep to the box, then your results will just be expensive nonsense, but you won't even know that. Now, if the rest of the mob that weren't part of this test got drenched 2 weeks ago, then it's going to be a good idea to drench all of these sheep this time. Certainly some of the drenches will be effective. Most likely those newer ones are going to be good, but you don't necessarily know for all the others. So I'm just inclined to drench all of them again with whatever it was that the main mob got. What you do need to remember is that you'll end up with a mob that's got 2 drenching times in there. It means that when you're now looking in the future of when they get drenched next, you have to keep that in mind. So maybe you're doing egg counts, you probably want to be a little bit conservative and drench at a slightly lower egg count because you've got a mix of animals in there. Now, when it comes to actually collecting the samples from the rectum, you can, like my picture up here, reach over and take the samples, but I find that that's usually not so good. I find it easiest to be in the race with them. This is my race here, and it's quite a narrow race, and I find it easy to get in the race with them, and I sort of pin them up against one side of the race to keep them still. But depending on your race and so forth, you'll find a way that it's comfortable and able to restrain the sheep while you're doing it. Make sure you use some gloves. You really need some lubricant on your fingers for each sheep. Go gently. You don't want to damage the rectal wall. And just hook out some dung with your finger. Now, you will need at least half one of these little bottles. I'll just hold that to the camera. So there's my little bottles. You need about half of one of those, because remember, a WEC sample, a worm egg count, is going to be done from them, as well as the rest of the sample being used for the culture. So you need half a bottle there. Another tip I learned the hard way is don't go and put your sheep on some lush feed or some oats prior to doing the test. You'll end up with pretty runny poo, and that's really a lot harder to collect than if you'd purposely gone and put them onto as dry a feed as possible for a few days before the test. Okay, you've done all your sampling, you've got them in the containers, you've got to fill out your forms. What you've got to do is make sure that one drench group is in one box or bag, another group is in a different bag, and you probably will have to provide a submission form with each of those bags. What you want to do is make sure that the lab knows these samples are part of a drench test, that each treatment or control group is identified to a particular drench group. The most important thing is that regardless of what count they have, you get a level culture done on them. Even if they come back with a 0 egg count, you will find most of the time that the lab will be able to culture the odd worm out of them. And that tells you something. If there's, you might have got 0, but at least a certain type of worm has survived. So pack and send the samples as per the lab's instructions. And as I said before, we've got a page on our website called Collecting Dung Samples from Individual Sheep or Goats, and that will give you some tips on how to do all that. Okay, so using the results. Well, it's going to take maybe about 10 days for you to get all your culture results. So you'll have your counts within a matter of days once they've completed them. But then they've got to culture them. That's going to take about 7 days. And then by the time they get all that data ready for you and do some analysis, it's probably going to be at least 10 days for you. The lab or the vet will analyse and do all those calculations for you. And what they'll do is compare active that you've tested to the undrenched group. In other words, if they were 1,000 eggs per gram or something or other, whereas one of your drench group was only 100, you've got 90% effectiveness on that drench. You can also calculate the effectiveness of the combinations. Your lab probably won't do that, but it's really easy for you to do that on the WormBoss website, and I'll show you that shortly. Now, realise that if you've got more than one worm type there, more than one worm species, then you're going to get a result for those different species. And your results are going to be, a drench is going to be effective if it's 98% effective or more. But lower than that, really, you're going to class that as resistant. So it is important to note that each worm type on your property may be resistant or susceptible, is not resistant, to different drenches and at different levels. For example, Drench X may reduce the Barber's poleworm infection by 98%, but it may only reduce the black scoureworm infection by 30%. So Drench X would therefore be effective Barber's poleworm drench, but not an effective drench against black scoureworm. Now, if you want to calculate the effectiveness of combination drenches after you have tested single actives, we've got this cute little calculator on our website. So the first thing that you do is go onto the WormBoss website, go to the tests and tools, and then you can choose management tools. You'll end up here and you can choose this thing called the combination drench efficacy calculator. And this is what you see when it opens up. First of all, it's got the instructions, and what you do here is this is where you're going to enter your results for your single active drenches. Then what happens automatically is in the part just down below here, all this will fill up with the efficacy results after you've put the single active data in. So here's an example. So here we see that, I'm just not sure whether you can see that clearly, but in the first row we've got BZ drenches, and in the second row I've got levamisole. So this one's got 67% effective against barber's pole. This one's 71% effective against barber's pole. And then down further, BZ levamisole has been calculated to be 90% effective based on the two results up here. Okay, so you don't have to do anything. You just put the single active results in, and these will all calculate by themselves. Okay. Now, you can, if you want a copy of this yourself, you can just go down the bottom there and you'll find that there's a downloadable Excel spreadsheet, and you open that and it just looks a bit of a different color, but it's the same thing in an Excel spreadsheet as the one we've got on the website. And the same thing, you can put data in there, and all of the calculations will just automatically be done for you once you put your data in up in the yellow part. Okay, I'm going to show you some drench test results now, and these are the results from the MLA-funded WormBoss project that we ran in the New England in 2016, 17 and 18. And there's 10 properties across the top here, and they've got drenches down the side, the single actives down the side. And I'll just show you some of the results that we've got so you understand what sort of differences really occur here. So even though over on this side we've got the averages that, say, for instance, a BZ drench on average was 46%, or a chlosanthal drench on average was 96%. When you look at the properties, the individual properties, just glance across all of those, you can see considerable differences in profile of drench resistance on each farm. And so here's an example where you've got property C having only 7% effectiveness for BZs. Now, I'll just mention to you again, this is on against barb poleworm. It's in New England. 7% on one property, but 98% effective on another property, and then everything in between. Another example is we go down to abamectin, and we can see that this property again, C, 25% effective on that, but 90% on that next property. And again, all these differences in between. The point is that we do publish data that gives you sort of approximate levels of what resistance might be in your region, but really, till you do your own test, you're still taking a wild guess. And when you do these tests, just like these 10 people did in this trial, some of them got a fairly rude shock, really opened their eyes to the fact that some of the drenches they thought were working for them weren't as good as they thought. And in the end, they've all thought it's pretty crucial to do this test, and it's really now dictating what drenches they use. And just go down to the bottom here now. Here's the calculated results for the combination drenches. Again, like I showed in that other example, here's your BZ and your levamisole here. Property A, 53% for one of them, 76% for the other. That comes to 89% for the combo. Again, knowing what the individuals are within here is pretty important to know whether or not you really got a good combination or one where one product or two products are doing most of the work. Because you're using a combo to try to preserve those drenches, and you want them both to be as effective as possible. Nevertheless, what you can see from this quite clearly, I think, is that you've certainly got a lot greater effectiveness with your combination products. However, they're not all totally effective. Just because it's a combination, you shouldn't assume that it's going to work for you. Look at this one down here, 51%, but on another property, it's 100%. So it's a better bet using a combo, but it's not a sure thing. Now, if you do a drench test, say you've got not enough animals, then doing a drench check is not as accurate, but it's certainly cheaper, and it's quick, and it's easy. It'll give you some useful results, and it could be what you need to find out, oh, gee, I really do need to test these sheep properly. We've got an example here and of how we might do one. So first of all, you start off, again, just doing your normal monitoring of your mobs. And when you think that they're coming up for a drench, send in your dung samples for a worm egg count. And again, tell your lab, look, if they're up at a drenching level, maybe that might be 600, 700, 800 up in Barber's poleworm area. It might be only 200 scale worm areas, 200 or 300. If they're at that sort of threshold, ask for a culture to be done. And that will then let you know what proportion of different worms are in the sample. And it's pretty handy because you're going to be able to look at the specific worms once you do your after test. So you've done this before test, got a culture done. Now you're going to just drench that mob with whatever drench that you choose to do, whether it's a combination, a single active, whatever, just one drench for the mob. Come back in 14 days' time and take another sample from the mob. Now you can get that from the paddock, but you really should do that as a individual counts. Anyone who listens to our webinar on bulk worm testing a few weeks back will know that it's a really good way to do a test on your mob. But for the post-drench check, in a drench check, make sure you test the individual. So just get 10 samples, send them in. The reason that you do that instead of getting a bulk at time is you just want to make sure that you don't have some outlier in the group. You know, you might have 10 samples, one of them's really high. It might mean that that sheep might have missed a drench. And so what you'll do is discard that result and just average the rest of them. Anyway, you end up with a count before you've drenched as well as after you've drenched. We're going to have a look at the results we've got in this table here. So it could be, for instance, this is why a culture is useful. It could be, for instance, if I can find the thing again, that you started off with a count of 1,000 eggs per gram. Let's say you're in Barber's poleworm area. The culture back initially could have been 90% Barber's poleworm, 10% scaleworms. Once you drench, 14 days later, do a test, do a culture, you might suddenly find you've got 100% Barber's poleworm next time and no scaleworms. It could be because you used something that, for instance, had abamectin or moxidectin in it, which typically tends to be really effective in this area against black scaleworm, but maybe not so great against Barber's poleworm. So that's one thing, you're going to see a difference in your cultures. You will also see that if you went from 1,000 eggs per gram initially to 100 eggs, 100 off 1,000 is 900. So what you found there, that it was 90% effective. But your culture is probably going to tell you some things about what worms it has killed as well. And so here you're going to find that 90%, remembering that Barber's poleworm to start was 90%, is 900 eggs per gram initially were Barber's poleworm. Now you're down at 100 eggs per gram of Barber's poleworm. You'll have found that the drench was 100% effective against scourworm, but not quite 90% effective against Barber's poleworm. So there is a benefit to doing a culture. Okay, so let's just finally see. There's plenty of resources for the Drench Resistance Test. You're going to find them on the WormBoss website. You'll find those service providers on there, so people that can do cultures, maybe there's some that can offer you a drench test. And it's got the regional programs, drench decision guides, and lots of information on there to help you with your worm control program. Now, Liz.
Thanks, Deb. Deb, while you just present these links on our last slide, I'd just like to ask our listeners to type in any questions they might have, and Deb will answer as many as possible in the next few minutes after she just tells you about these links.
As Liz said, type away and put in some questions. I'm sure that there will be some questions that the group has. And in the meantime, I'll just give you a bit of time to do that. I'll talk about the various links and other information that you can find. So WormBoss, of course, has got a mountain of information. You can find heaps of things there, pages there that talk about drench tests, checks, how to do worm egg counts, you name it, it's on there. The other thing, of course, is it'd be great if you all subscribe to ParaBoss News. And in fact, if you don't want to have to do that yourself, you can send your details, some name and address details, just respond back to Liz. You can do it in the chat function if you want, sending it to her, or send her an email later on, and we'll subscribe you to the newsletter. In addition, we've got 2 Facebook pages, one for sheep, one for goats, and we put about 4 posts per week on there if we can, about flies, lice and worms. And of course, some of you, I would imagine, have seen some of our other webinars already. For others, it's maybe your first time. If you've missed one of the webinars or you want to keep an eye out on what's coming up, go to paraboss.com.au, and there's our URL up there, news, webinars. If you go to ParaBoss, you'll find a thing there that's got news, and if you click on that, you'll find webinars, and you'll find it under there. You can see the recorded ones that we've already got from before. And Liz, what do you reckon? Do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. Let me just have a quick look here. Okay, our first question is from Robert. He said that he thought that levamisole worked on adults and BZ worked on young worms, and that therefore the duo drench was better than the sum of the two individual drenches. What do you think?
That was no one's ever told me that. I've never heard it in any discussions about that difference in which ones they work on. I will say that the age of the worms can be an issue with organophosphate drenches. So when you give the old Ramiton, which doesn't exist anymore, but any of those new ones with naphthalphos in them, they can be less effective on the larvae or the young worms, the immature worms, and more effective on the adults. Now, whether or not Robert's heard that and thought that about levamisole or BZ, but I don't think that's the case, but it is with organophosphate.
Okay, thanks, Deb. I had another question from Sarah. How come you only have to test one of the BZ or white drenches, but you have to test two of their mLs?
Yeah. The BZs are considered to all work. There they are. These BZs are considered to all have pretty much the same effectiveness. They're close enough molecules that they're going to work most the same. Whereas abamectin, oxydectin, while they're both in the macrocyclic chain group, they do fall into different subgroups. Abamectin tends to be less potent than moxidectin. They do work a little bit differently. Those results I showed you, I'll just see if I can again. Those results, if we go up here, this is our abamectin row above the blank line, which is ivermectin, which wasn't tested. So that's abamectin. And this one's moxidectin. And you will typically, but not always, you will typically see maybe a 10 to 20% in them, so that moxidectin's usually a lot better than abamectin. So that's why we test both of them, because they don't actually act just the same. They're not within the same group. They're not within the same subgroup within macrocyclic lactones.
Okay, thanks, Deb. I had a couple of questions from Leslie. They're dealing with trike, and they had a larval culture come back with a 98% trike. It's the wrong time of year in barber's pole worm in New Zealand, he said. So he's asked that they seem to have an issue with abamectin, as they've overused Genesis Ultra. Matrix, a drench we've never used, is also not performing well. He wants to know if cross-grazing will help cattle hoover up the larvae, or are the trikes going to survive in the cattle?
Okay, some will survive in the cattle, certainly, but there are different trike, some of them, not all of them, and oops, I've lost that again. And yes, they will help to get rid of them, but if you keep grazing the sheep in there, then they will still keep contaminating the paddock. So it's not going to totally solve the problem. It will help a little bit, but not totally. If Leslie listens to our last webinar, which was on preparing low worm risk paddocks, that will help because it will actually outline how you do that cross grazing really meaning that you will you'll graze with one species and not with the other, and then you swap them around. If you keep them together all the time, you will certainly dilute what's on the paddock, and the cattle will eat some of them, but it won't totally solve your problem, and it certainly probably won't solve it if it's a bulbous poleworm problem. Thanks.
Deb. I've also got a couple of questions from Kate. I'd like to know that okay to do a drench test if the animals haven't ever been drenched before?
Yes, it is. That's what's commonly done in southern Australia when they use weaners. My preference is to give them one drench to sort of even them up, but the tests are very successfully done in southern Australia using weaners that have never been drenched before. So yes, it does work.
Okay, great. And her follow-up question is, how often should resistance tests be performed?
Each 3 years.
Right. Excuse me. Thanks, Deb. I have a question from Sandy and also Anthony, same question. They would like to know if there is anywhere that they can buy a kit of drenches for a resistance test. Old drums make it uneconomical.
Yeah, it does. It does. The things that I would like to propose for ParaBoss is that we might actually have kits that can be sold directly to people or out through any of the laboratories or vets or anything like that, but we don't have that at the moment. I can't answer the question definitively at the moment who offers them, but I know that Invetus was offering them in the past. I think Dorbert's may well do that. So you can try some of the big testing laboratories and you might find that they offer you a test that you can buy. And that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Thanks, Deb. And I've got one last question from Adrian. They're a prime lamb operation where all of the breeding sheep are brought in. Based on your suggestion of testing young sheep, what should their testing regime be, given that they could be buying someone else's resistance?
Oh, well, you don't have to buy anyone else's resistance for a start, because you should be doing effective quarantine drenching. So that's number one. Get onto the WormBoss website, look in our search bar, look for quarantine drenching and avoid buying someone else's resistance in the first place. If you've got, were those bought sheep all adult ewes or something, were they?
Yeah, they're breeding sheep.
Okay, so you've got young sheep, but I'm guessing that these are quite possibly first cross ewes and they're prime lambs. And I acknowledge that a lot of people won't want to do a test on their prime lambs. And the other issue that does exist is that if you go and test something like Zolvex, which has got a 115-day, or was it 120-day withholding period, that's going to make it difficult for that particular group of sheep that you've drenched with that. So I can understand that in prime lambs, people will be fairly hesitant to do those. Look, if you really honestly have no other sheep to do, I guess you have to do it on your youngest group of ewes. You mightn't get as good a results, but that's all you've got. Combine that with your quarantine drenching, and so that you're not bringing more problems in, you should still be able to find out what the resistance profile is on that property.
Thanks, Deb. that seems to be the end of questions, but it's been a great webinar. Thank you very much, Deb, and I hope everybody has got a lot out of it, and I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking Deb for a fantastic presentation. Thanks, Deb, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone. And get on to Liz if you would like to join, subscribe to ParaBoss News, and we can send you some links or we can sign you up, and keep an eye out for our future webinars or look at the recorded ones. Thanks very much. Good night.
Thanks, Deb. Good night.